So if you clicked on this video, you're probably at least remotely interested in management consulting. And whether you're a beginner who has never heard of this industry, or you're someone who is actively pursuing recruiting and you already know a lot about the field, or perhaps you also work in consulting and you're just curious what another consultant's experience is like, this video is for you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt and I'm a current associate at BCG, which is a management consulting firm. And today I'm going to give you a very detailed overview of the management consulting industry. And the way that this video is going to be structured is, first we'll talk about what is consulting, then we'll talk about which firms play in the space, then we'll talk about how you even get into consulting, and then why people go into consulting, why people leave consulting, as well as what the day-to-day on the job looks like. And then we'll also talk about exit opportunities, and we'll talk about whether consulting actually creates value for society. And finally, we'll end with a discussion of who should even go into consulting in the first place. Now, I know this is going to be a pretty long video, so feel free to skip around to the sections that are most interesting to you. But anyways, let's get into it. So what even is consulting? Consulting at a conceptual level is the business of providing advice to other businesses, government entities, other organizations, or providing additional manpower to support those organizations' goals. Now, I just gave you a very broad definition, and I totally get it if you're like, what the heck, Matt? This is super vague. You basically just gave me a non-answer. But the reason why it's so difficult for people to understand sometimes what consulting firms actually do is because anything that is a business problem, any sort of issue that a company could face, could potentially turn into a consulting project. And so the reason why it's hard for people to tell you what consultants actually do is because they could be doing a lot of different things. And whereas in most jobs, the scope of work that you typically do is fairly defined. For example, in investment banking, you might be exclusively advising on mergers and acquisitions or IPOs. That's not the case in consulting. As I said, in consulting, anything that the CEO could be worried about or the board of directors could believe is a threat to the business could potentially turn into a consulting engagement. And so understanding this will make it very clear to you why people always struggle to understand what consulting firms do and why there's so many jokes that go around saying that consultants don't actually do anything, when in reality, they're doing quite literally so many different things that it's hard to pinpoint what a consultant is actually doing. But let's say we want to categorize the universe of consulting firms into specific categories. Well, how would we go about doing that? Broadly speaking, there is 4 buckets of consulting firms out there. The first is going to be known as strategy consulting firms. The second is going to be known as implementation-focused consulting firms. The third is going to be known as functional specialists. And the fourth we can call industry specialists. And I'll talk about each. So with strategy consulting firms, this is typically what people think about when they hear the word, oh, management consulting. And they think of this sexy job where you're advising CEOs on big business decisions. That's typically strategy consulting, because in strategy consulting, you are essentially advising the company's management on key business problems. It could be something like advising the shoe company Nike on why the Nike Free, which is a running shoe, is underperforming in Europe. It could be something like, should McDonald's change the menu in Norway? It could be something like, should NVIDIA, which is the chip making company, launch a new product in Europe? Or more infamously, it could be something like, should Spotify lay off 15 to 20% of its workforce? These are key business decisions that management will hire a strategy consulting firm to help them tackle. And so typical projects that strategy consulting firms will partake in will be things like a growth strategy, which is when you're trying to help them develop a strategy to grow the business or grow a particular product line, or even a due diligence assignment when you're diligencing a potential acquisition target for a business or for a private equity firm. Now, the universe of strategy firms is relatively small, I would say, but the undisputable pinnacle of strategy consulting is known as MBB, or McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. These are the 3 most established firms in the strategy consulting world. McKinsey was founded first, BCG came afterwards, and Bain was formed when a couple BCG employees left and founded a smaller competitor. Now, McKinsey is kind of known as like the most notorious consulting firm out there because they've been engaged in a lot of very controversial engagements over the past decade, which I won't get into, but you can do some Googling if you're curious about it. BCG is kind of known as like the brainiest and nerdiest firm out of the 3. And then Bain is known for its private equity practice, which is where they've built up a really strong reputation among investors. In terms of size, McKinsey is bigger than BCG, and then BCG is substantially larger than Bain. And then after the MBB, there are a set of smaller competitors known as Tier 2 strategy consulting firms. And these are firms that basically compete against MBB on similar types of projects, but they're maybe a little bit smaller in scale or maybe not as established. And so these are firms like LEK Consulting or Oliver Wyman, Strategy or EY Parthenon. Now, I do want to caveat that there are very few true strategy consulting firms out there. Technically, even firms like McKinsey, Bain, and BCG now do not only do pure play strategy. They've expanded into the implementation space and do all sorts of different projects for their clients because it's another source of revenue. For example, if I develop the strategy for Nike to launch a new shoe, I can also come to them and say, hey, I'll also help you execute it. And so that's how I win the implementation project as well. And so it just makes sense to kind of do both types of work because then you can both advise the client on the strategy and then also flex the expertise from developing the strategy to help them implement it. But that brings us to the second bucket of consulting firms out there, which are the implementation consulting firms. Now, the big players in this space are going to be firms like Accenture, as well as the Big Four accounting firms, which also now do a lot of implementation consulting work. So firms like EY, PwC, Deloitte, and KPMG are massive in the implementation consulting space. Now, what is implementation consulting? I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's essentially when you are helping the company execute the strategy. And so one of the most common types of projects that implementation consultants will do is what's known as a PMO, which stands for Project Management Office. Now, a PMO is essentially when a company hires a consulting firm to basically help them run an internal project. And typically this project is going to be like a very massive undertaking that the company alone would struggle to complete. Like, for example, executing on a very large transformative strategy. But it could be something even as simple as how do we upgrade all the IT in our business? It's a very large undertaking and requires a lot of coordination. It's quite complex. And so oftentimes they'll hire teams of consultants from firms like Accenture to help them run this entire process and basically make sure that deadlines are being met and that the internal team members at the company that are involved with this project are doing what they're supposed to do. And so one of the benefits of working in implementation consulting is you work very, very closely with the employees at the company. Like on a day-to-day basis, you're very much embedded into the company. You might even have a company email and use the company's internal like Teams messaging and their file sharing systems. You'll basically be like a contractor to the company that's hiring you. And these projects are much, much longer than typical strategy projects. Now, obviously there's a range, but like a typical strategy project might be a month to like a couple months, but an implementation project can literally be as long as a year, if not longer. There are some people that I personally know who work at Accenture who have been on certain projects for over a year. That comes with its own set of pros and cons, which I won't debate here, but the bottom line is it's a very different experience working in implementation projects than it is working on strategy. And so that's a very important thing to keep in mind if you are interested in recruiting for consulting, is which type of consulting you actually want to do. Now let's move to our third bucket of consulting firms, which is the functional specialists. Now, functional specialists are really interesting because they're often highly specialized in a particular function or type of work. Now, let me give you an example. When companies go bankrupt or are in need of restructuring, they often bring in what are known as financial consulting firms. And these are firms like FTI Consulting, Alvarez & Marsal, or AlixPartners. If you haven't heard of these firms, that's okay. But during my junior year summer internship in investment banking, I worked at a restructuring-focused investment bank, and I essentially worked very, very closely with these guys. And I can tell you that the type of work that they do is very, very different from what a typical strategy consulting firm or a Big Four accounting firm or an Accenture would do. They are very much focused on the financial aspect of the business, and they basically do a ton of financial modeling, what's known as 13-week cash flow modeling, which is modeling out the liquidity needs of the business for the next 13 weeks. It's a very common practice when a company is in distress and is approaching bankruptcy or in bankruptcy, is you hire one of these financial consulting firms to help you manage and project the liquidity of the business. And so another name for this kind of consulting is what's known as turnaround consulting or restructuring consulting. And again, it is very, very different. I cannot stress enough, it is very different from strategy consulting. In strategy consulting, you very rarely actually do complex financial modeling, but in this kind of job, you do it all the time. And so the skill set that you'll develop is very, very much differentiated in that way. Now, that's just one example of a specialist consulting firm. there are other specialist consulting firms. Like think about design consulting firms like IDEO or Frog. These are very well-known firms in a very niche space, and the type of work that they're doing is very, very different. But because they're so specialized, they have a competitive edge in that other bigger firms that are maybe more generalist can't compete or don't have the same level of expertise. Now, to round it out, the fourth type of consulting firm out there are the industry specialists. These, as the name suggests, are firms that basically exclusively consult in a particular industry. And you'll find a lot of these in healthcare. So firms like Putnam Associates, Clearview Healthcare Partners, or Chartis are firms that pretty much only consult in the healthcare space, and they flex their competitive edge by the fact that they spend all their time and focus on that particular area. These firms will often also employ a ton of highly experienced PhDs or like research-oriented individuals that have a lot of experience in like life sciences or biopharma. And so basically the value proposition of these industry specialists is that they know the space super well and they know it better than other firms that are more spread thin across other industries. Now, I do want to note that there is not one type of consulting firm that is necessarily better than another. It really comes down to what your personal goals are, like what you find interesting and what you want to work on, as well as what your potential career goals in the future are, which will inform what sort of consulting firm you pursue in the short term. But now that we've talked about the 4 different buckets of consulting firms, let's talk about how you even get into consulting. And so one of the things that is very unique about the consulting industry is that the interview process is relatively rigorous compared to if you were interviewing at a regular company. Consulting firms will employ what's known as the case interview, which is a style of consulting where basically the interviewer will give the interviewee a very ambiguous and often open-ended business problem, and they'll essentially ask you to come up with what's known as a framework, which is a structured way of solving the problem. So to give you just one example of what a framework might look like, say for example, somebody asks me, hey Matt, how would you evaluate whether or not a business is an attractive one? And so a way that I could go about coming up with a framework is I could tell you, okay, so this is really interesting. So we're trying to learn a little bit more about this company and understand whether or not it's an attractive business to potentially invest in. So there are, broadly speaking, 4 buckets that I would want to dig a little bit deeper into to understand whether or not this is attractive or not. First would be understanding the competition. The second would be understanding the product that this company makes. The third would be understanding the customer dynamics. So who are the customers of this business? And the fourth would be understanding a little bit better the company itself. So what are its strengths and weaknesses, things of that sort. And then after I go through that, I would basically go back from the top and talk through like a few key questions that I would have in each of these buckets. So for example, if it's with the competition, here I want to understand, is the market attractive? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it staying the same? Is it a big market? Is it a small market? I also want to understand who the other competitors are. Is this market highly fragmented? Are there a ton of small players but no one dominant player? Or is it a market that's dominated by 2 or 3 really big players, which would make it quite difficult for a smaller entrant to really win? Questions like that. And so essentially you would go through each of these buckets and you would just present the interviewer with a few key questions that you want to dig into. And so that, at a high level, is what a framework is. So don't be intimidated when you hear someone ask you for a framework or when you hear people talking about different types of frameworks. A framework at the most basic level is literally just a set of key areas that you, as the interviewer, want to explore a little bit deeper to improve your understanding of the situation and get enough data so that you can make a reasonable assessment of the situation. And so the ambiguity is what terrifies most people, because oftentimes in these case interviews, especially for strategy consulting firms, you'll be asked things like, hey, do you think that this company should launch a new product? Or how would you decide whether or not to outsource labor for this particular factory? Or even tell me how you would go about sizing the market for Christmas trees in London. And so all of these are very ambiguous and open-ended questions that don't necessarily have a single right answer. And so I think that scares a lot of people. But what you have to understand is that casing is just a skill, and any skill can be learned. All it's going to take is practice, obviously, but also getting proper feedback from people who actually know what they're doing, so that you can improve each time. And I do have a video that talks about casing. So if you're curious about it and you want to learn a little bit more, feel free to check that one out. But the next thing I want to address is, does casing actually matter for the job itself? And I would say that yes and no. Yes, in that casing often does provide like a theoretical representation of what a strategy project would typically look like, but it really takes out a lot of the day-to-day, like tactical, nitty-gritty details of what a case project actually looks like. So just to give you an example, one of the big issues that you often run into when you're on a case is, how do you even get the data that you need to make an assessment of the situation? Now, in a case interview setting, you would just be able to ask the interviewer for the data and they would probably just give it to you. But oftentimes in a consulting environment, half the battle is getting to the data that you actually need. So case interviews are more of like an ideal scenario where you can just ask all the questions that you want and hopefully have the data available. When in reality, the project itself is going to require a lot more legwork with getting to the data and insights that you're actually looking for. So now that we've talked about how you get into consulting, we should discuss why people even go into consulting in the first place. Like, what is the draw, right? There's this super rigorous interview process. Why do I want to go through all this effort to learn how to case and to go through the interviews and all the possible rejections just to land this job? Well, there's a lot of good reasons why people want to go into consulting and why it is one of the most popular jobs for people coming out of top undergrad business programs as well as top MBA programs. And I also do want to caveat that going forward in this video, a lot of what I talk about is going to be more relevant to strategy consulting just because I work at a strategy consulting firm, and so a lot of my experiences are shaped around that type of work. And so apologies if I misrepresent some of the work that other firms do in consulting, but I just want to make that very clear before we keep going. So anyways, consulting is a very popular career path for business students because one, it pays very well. For example, somebody working at a top strategy consulting firm nowadays, out of MBA, you can probably make somewhere between 150 to 200K. At my firm, BCG, a post-MBA consultant right out of business school makes a $190,000 base salary, and that's not even including the bonus as well as all the other benefits that come on top of that. And so easily in your first year, you're breaking 200K. Now, obviously the MBB salaries are gonna represent the upper bound of the salary range, so I think you can expect that other firms will fall somewhere below that on a spectrum. And if you come out of undergrad, you're easily breaking six figures at a top strategy firm. So for example, at BCG, first year associates, they make $110,000 as their base salary, and then you have a bonus that's tacked on top of that. And I think on average, the bonus is somewhere around like 20% of your base salary. But essentially, from a financial perspective, it's very lucrative, and so that is a big draw for a lot of people. But it's also not just about the money, because the other big reason that people like to go into consulting is the exit opportunities. If you go into consulting and you do like at least 2 to 3 years, you have a universe of very interesting and well-paying opportunities available to you after you exit. Some of the more popular exits are going to be in finance, like private equity or venture capital, as well as roles in industry like corporate strategy, product management, business development, or roles in startups. And there's pros and cons of all of these, but I'm gonna talk about them a little bit more in the exit opportunities section of this video. But all you have to understand is that the exit opportunities are a huge draw for a lot of people to go into consulting in the first place. Now, another reason is that there's relative prestige to this industry because as a relatively young person, you're able to interface with a lot of executives at a lot of different companies, and you're exposed to a lot of like different industries and project types. And so it's a very sexy job to have, especially when you factor in the fact that oftentimes you're staying at really nice hotels, you're flying business class on planes across the country, and you frequently have like fancy team dinners. One of the things that I personally think is a little bit over the top in consulting is every single case that you're on, you basically have at least one team event, which is when the entire team just goes out to eat at like a Michelin star restaurant, or maybe you do something fun like you go go-karting or you go to like a sporting event. These are experiences that normally you wouldn't get if you were working at a typical company, or you just wouldn't get them as frequently as you do in consulting. On top of that, you get expensed Ubers from the office. You also get expensed meals. The expense policy at BCG is extremely, extremely generous. Up to $100, you don't have to provide a receipt. I definitely don't think this is like the industry average, but it is a very common practice for consulting firms to allow employees to expense dinners in the office when you're working late. Now, on top of all of these perks, there's also really, really interesting career development opportunities that these consulting firms provide their employees. These would be things like going on a secondment or an externship, which is essentially when you get to work for 3 to 6 months at a different company or a different organization and get to like try it out while you're still technically employed by your consulting firm. And then you go back afterwards. And so it gives you an interesting outside perspective without having to actually leave the company that you're at. On top of that, there's also MBA sponsorship opportunities. If you are someone that went into consulting as an undergrad at top consulting firms like MBB, they will fully sponsor, which means fully pay for your MBA. That's like $200,000 worth of free money, essentially. Now, it's not free in reality because you do actually have to be in good standing with the firm and also agree to work at the firm for at least another 2 years, I believe, after you get your MBA program. But it is an extremely nice perk to be able to go to business school on your company's dime. Other interesting opportunities that consulting firms give their employees are things like office transfers to different offices. It's very easy to move around internally, as well as unpaid leaves of absence, where basically you can just stop working for a couple months and pursue some other things in your personal life. And so overall, the benefits that consulting firms give their employees are really, really generous, and there's just a lot of opportunities that you could never get if you worked at a regular company. Now, another reason that people will say that they want to go into consulting is they want to use it as like a career accelerator to eventually move into C-suite roles. Now, it is up for debate whether or not consulting actually makes you into a better leader, but one thing is for certain, and that is that by working in consulting, you basically learn what it's like to operate at a really high level, and it gives you the chance to experience a lot of different things in a very short time frame. And so for a lot of people who don't necessarily know what they want to do with their career, there's a lot of value in that. And my throat is so dry. This is like my first time recording a really long video, and so my throat is just not ready for this. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you're finding it helpful, please do consider hitting the like button and also subscribing if you haven't already. I put a ton of work into these videos and I really want to make content that you guys want to watch. But anyways, let's get back to it. So I feel like now that we've talked about why people go into consulting, it's just fair that we should also talk about the reasons that people leave consulting, right? Because if this job is so amazing and it has all these perks and it pays well, why would you want to leave? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to leave. The first of which is that it's a very, very demanding job. So the typical hours that you would work at a top strategy consulting firm could range anywhere from 50 to 75 hours a week. And so for a lot of people, what this means is during the week from Monday through Friday, you are unable to really make plans with people. If you're going to meet up with friends or go on a date or hang out with your family, that's probably going to happen on the weekend. And on top of that, there is an element of travel. So if your project requires you to travel, then from usually Monday through Thursday, you will be on the road and you'll be living out of a hotel, taking flights either on Sunday night or early Monday morning to the client site, and then flying back Thursday night so that Friday you can work either remotely at home or in the office. And so I have to say that for a lot of younger people, the travel might seem really cool and glamorous, but look, the reality is it just isn't. Imagine if you have to fly to Little Rock, Arkansas every single week, where there's nothing to do, you're staying in like a Marriott, you spend your day at the client site in like a windowless conference room, and then afterwards you go back to your hotel, and even if you finish your work early, you're still stuck in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's really not as glamorous as people think. I feel like I just have to say this because a lot of people view the travel and consulting as like one of the sexiest parts of the job, but I personally don't think it's that cool, and I think that it just adds an element of additional stress to your already demanding job. Like imagine if you're flying between time zones too, and your sleep schedule is getting messed up. And on top of that, you're working crazy hours, you're stressed out because your manager is stressed because the client is super demanding. And then you have to go to the client site every day and put on a great face. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm trying to paint a really accurate picture of the fact that after you travel the first couple times, it really loses its glamour. And especially for people who have families and children, they really don't want to be away from their families for that long. And so the travel and the sustainability is a big reason why a lot of people end up just leaving. Now, the other reason that people will leave is because there's typically an up or out culture at a lot of these top strategy firms. Every 6 months, you basically get formally reviewed by all the managers that you've worked on cases with over the past 6 months. And depending on your performance, you may or may not be asked to leave the firm. If you don't meet the performance benchmarks for promotion, then that means you have to leave and you have to find another job. Now, these firms are usually pretty nice about it. Like they will give you notice in advance, and at some firms like at BCG, they actually even pay you to just look for a job, which is insane. But a lot of people, even if they want to stay, will end up being pushed out because of this up or out culture. I would say that the average tenure at a consulting firm is usually under 5 years. Now don't quote me on this, it's just anecdotal based on my conversations with coworkers and other people in the industry. Greater than 50% of people will usually leave within like 2 to 3 years for many of the reasons that I've already mentioned. The last reason that people will leave is usually because they find something that they just like more than consulting, and that's totally valid. For a lot of people, consulting is not the terminal career for them, and they use it as a stepping stone to get to something a little bit more interesting or better paying. And so a lot of people will leave on their own volition because they've just landed an offer in a different industry doing something else. So the next thing I want to talk about is, what does the actual day-to-day look like? Now, I hate saying this, but I'm gonna have to say it again. It really depends, because what you're doing is gonna depend on what project you're actually working on. Now, what I can tell you is that when you are in a project, it's gonna be a very high-touch environment, which means you're going to be interacting with a ton of people on a day-to-day basis. You're going to be interacting with your teammates, you're going to be interacting with the client, you're going to be interacting with third parties that are involved with this case. There's going to be a ton of in-person interaction, and so as a consultant, you really learn to develop your soft skills. And that's one of the big benefits of working in such a fast-paced team environment is you get a lot of exposure to people older than you, and so you learn how to communicate well and present yourself and just have very good presence. Now, in terms of the work output, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the output is going to be PowerPoint slides, and then maybe 10 to 20% of the time it's some sort of analysis in Excel or a market model, for example. Now, again, this is for strategy consulting because if you're doing something like financial restructuring consulting or turnaround consulting, you are probably spending a lot more time in Excel because they do much more complex financial models on a daily basis. So I don't want to generalize, but at strategy consulting firms, you're spending a lot more time in PowerPoint than you are in Excel. Something that I also feel obligated to share with you guys is that in strategy consulting, you're really not analyzing financial statements as much as I think people might believe. I used to work in investment banking, and so I come from a very technical background, and I understand financial modeling and the financial statements and everything. But I think there's this misconception, especially among people who want to move into private equity, that their consulting job is going to set them up well to work in finance. And yes, in some ways it will, because you'll understand at a high level what makes a market attractive and things like that. But you really do need to self-study the financial modeling aspects of it, because you don't learn that kind of stuff on the job in consulting. But anyways, back to the day-to-day. So typically in terms of meetings, you'll have at least a check-in and a check-out call with your case team, which is when you basically just get aligned with your manager on what you're actually working on for the day and what you need to work on to close out for the night. And then you'll also usually during the week have at least 1 to 2 CTMs, which are case team meetings, when you discuss with the senior managing directors the work that you've been doing and the progress that you've made so far. And then on top of that, you'll also have client meetings. The cadence of the client meetings will really depend on what sort of project it is. For example, if it's a very high-touch implementation project, you'll probably be touching base with the client on a daily basis. But if it's a due diligence project, you will probably only have 2 or 3 readouts over the course of the project, which means you're only really seeing the client a couple times over the course of a month. So what about if you're not on a case? Well, if you're not on a case, then you're either doing one of 2 things. One is you're not doing anything, which is what's known as being on the beach or on the bench. And the other thing is you're probably working on some short-term staffing. Now, short-term staffing takes the form of one of 2 things. One is you're either working on a proposal, or 2, you're helping an existing case out with some random tasks that they just need additional support for. And I'll talk a little bit about proposals. So proposals are essentially when you're helping a manager director with business development. And so oftentimes what happens is you're competing against other consulting firms to win the business of a client. And so proposal work is typically lighter touch than typical casework. You're not going as in depth because you only want to show the client that you have enough expertise, but you don't want to actually do all the work, because that's what you're supposed to do when you win their business. So you only do just enough work to show them that you have the knowledge and the expertise that it takes to deliver a good outcome for them. And you don't actually get to participate in the pitch itself, because the managing directors are going to be in the call, and you as the associate or the analyst, you're not allowed to sit in on that call. And so that's just something that I think is important to understand about proposal work, because you're not going to get the level of client interaction that you would get if you were on a real case. Okay, now let's talk about exit opportunities. And I know a lot of you are probably really excited about exit opportunities. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the more common exits out there. So the first one is finance. These are things like private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital. I'll tell you right off the bat, from my experience, very, very little consultants ever go into hedge funds. And the reason for this is your skill set really is not that applicable to public investing, and you're not as close to the financial statements as I mentioned. You're not going to have the same level of knowledge analyzing financial statements as somebody who worked in investment banking, for example. Now that said, a lot of private equity firms do hire consultants because they like people with operational expertise. And so if we were to hypothetically break down what percentage of people leave for finance exits, I would say it's around 20%. And that 20% is going to be skewed towards private equity and venture capital. And the reason why a lot more people are going into private equity and venture capital is because, again, as I mentioned, PE firms like consultants for the operational expertise, and then venture capital firms don't really require you to have very strong finance technical skills, because you're really investing in companies that don't even have much financials to show in the first place. You're investing in a concept, really, in an idea, in a management team. And so the consultants that do go into finance exits will often be going into private equity or venture capital. The second bucket of exit opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, was industry opportunities. So things like product management or corporate strategy or business development. This is probably like the largest percentage. So maybe like 50% of people who leave will go into these sort of industry roles. And oftentimes the reason why people like to go into these roles is they're relatively cushy. They're not as intense as a consulting job, but then they have decent pay and the work is like relatively interesting. Now, I do need a caveat that the experience is going to be so variable depending on what company you actually work at. And so you need to be super careful about what company and what role you actually go into. Otherwise, you might just have a bad experience. And then the third bucket of opportunities that people will go into after consulting is startups. I would say maybe 20% of people would go into startups. The reason why people will go into startups is because you arguably have more impact coming in at a very small organization that's really fast growing. And the rationale is that as a consultant, you bring a lot of skills to the table. And so you can move really fast and help this really scrappy team to create a successful business. Now, the pay isn't necessarily going to be better than consulting when you go to a startup, but of course, you're not in it for the pay, you're in it for like the potential equity upside. And so there's higher risk, but also potentially higher reward there. So if we said finance is about 20%, industry roles is about 50%, and then startups is about another 20%, then the remaining 10% is going to be what I'll just bucket as other, which is nonprofits or people who end up going to business school. And so this is probably the smallest proportion, if I had to guess, of the exits that people would go to. And broadly speaking, from what I can observe, at least anecdotally, I would say less than 25% of people in consulting actually end up staying at their consulting firm and like rising up through the ranks. The reason for this is, again, there's so many exits that you could go to that people will often just leave on their own accord, but also because, again, as I mentioned, the up or out culture creates sort of this situation where if you're not a top performer, you're just not going to be promoted even if you want to stay. So the next thing I want to talk about is a little bit more high level, and I want to just lay out the philosophical debate of, does consulting actually bring value to society? And this is a very controversial topic. People love to talk consulting. The argument is that consulting firms don't actually bring value to society because they are not creating anything tangible. Like, you're not actually creating a product, you're just giving advice. And oftentimes you see consulting firms like McKinsey in the news for very bad reasons because they advise on very controversial topics, or there's conflicts of interest, or they're just advising corporations and entities that are involved in suspicious or illegal activities. Now, on the flip side of that, the proponents of consulting will say that consulting is a very valuable industry for society. Otherwise, why would it even exist if there wasn't at least some degree of value? And from what I can observe, I would say that the real value that consulting firms are bringing to the table is they're able to get things done a lot quicker and oftentimes bring in a level of expertise that maybe the client doesn't have that can really help a company achieve its goals quicker. So finally, I want to close with who should go into consulting. Now, as someone who didn't pursue consulting when I was an undergrad, because I thought that consulting was an industry only for extroverted, charismatic, and super intelligent people, I want to tell you that you really shouldn't feel intimidated by these consulting firms. Yes, there is a very rigorous interview process, and yes, the people that get into these firms are usually high achievers. But if you are someone who is very interested in business, you like understanding different businesses, what differentiates a good from a bad one, and you don't quite know what you want to do with your career, which is totally fine, but you still want to develop a very strong foundation, working with really high-performing teams and being placed in situations where you have a lot of responsibility as a young person, then I think it's worth considering consulting as a potential path. Another thing that I think consulting really excels at as a job is bringing so much variety to your work. You're working on so many different project types, on so many different companies and different industries that you really never get bored. And over the past almost year and a half that I've been at my current firm, I really can't say that I've felt bored because every couple of months I'm working on something different. The final thing I would say is that if you enjoy working in a team-based environment, then consulting is a good option because, again, you're interacting with your teams on a very frequent basis. But the most important thing to consider, of course, is the people that you're working with because they're going to have the biggest impact on how your experience is. I would argue that the people and the team and your manager will have a much bigger impact on your day-to-day experience than the actual work that you do on the job. But anyways, I hope that you found this video helpful. And if you guys made it to the end, first of all, I'm super impressed, but also let me know in the comments what you liked most about this video. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.